introduce Dr. Gabriel Di Meglio to you, our speaker. He is a professor of history at the University of Buenos Aires. He got his PhD there. He is also a member of CONICET, which is Argentina's government research arm that funds researchers. He is a very productive scholar. It's hard to keep track of all of his books, so I'm sure I only have part of them here. Let's see. So this is one of them. Wait, this is yours? Let's see. My clicker is not working here. So oh, did it? Oh, here we go. These are just a few of his books. Okay, well, it's coming in delayed. So even PowerPoint's having a hard time finding all of them. Okay, and so these are the latest two, maybe? Okay, so on 1816 on independence, the 200th anniversary, and then this is one just brand new out, a history of looting in Argentina. And I guess there's a part in there about the American soldiers that landed in 1852 in Argentina. After Rosas is defeated, American soldiers land. So they don't just land in Mexico. They're landing all across the hemisphere. He is also the director of the Cabildo Museum. If you've ever been to the Plaza de Mayo, right in the middle of Buenos Aires, he is the director of the museum that's in the Cabildo building. And he is also a TV personality. Was. Okay, I think we have a little clip right here. All right, well, that's good. I don't know where the sound went, but anyway, so we are very fortunate to have Gabriel Di Meglio talking about a current research project that he's involved in himself, along with a group of Latin American scholars from around the hemisphere. So we're hearing some cutting edge stuff today. So let's join in giving him a round of applause.
Well, good morning. Pleased to meet you. I'm glad to be here in BYU again, and thank you. I want to thank especially Jeffrey for bringing me here. It's great to be here for the whole month. Today I want to share with you some results of an ongoing research. You know, as Professor Janway said, I work for a lot of time in popular participation, right, in the city of Buenos Aires, which is my city, in the period of the independence and then the first half of the 19th century, the moment when the republic started to be built, right? And now, with a group of historians from Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, we are trying to put some things together of how this moment of shaping new republics was in South America, and trying to connect some things that we have in common, some other differences. So we are 7 scholars, and each of us took one topic, right, to research it in the whole South America continent, right? We left Mexico outside because it's not South America, even if we are dealing all the time, we are talking all the time with Mexican historiography, which is really rich. I mean, Mexican and Mexicanist, okay? But we are now focusing only in South America, and in my case, given that I have for a lot of time research on popular participation, I took that subject, right? I mean, how did the common people participate in politics in the whole South American area between the independence and mid-19th century when these republics were born? But in this specific topic, I had to, I mean, when I started this research, that of course is not with primary sources, but with the text of other historians, right? Because it's a really, really big thing. And luckily for people who like this popular history now, it's been 30 years that you have many, many books and articles appearing in all the countries, in the US, in Europe, of Latin Americans too, about this presence of the lower classes in politics, right? Traditionally, in the traditional narratives of the independence and the construction of the republics, they were absent. Politics was just a thing of the leaders, right, of the elites. Or if these popular groups were just being manipulated and used by the elites with no given agency, no objectives of their own. So in my opinion, in this case, is always to try to understand why these people were making politics, right? Without a romantic view, without this idea of, the poor are good. I mean, just the idea of how did they do things, why they were part of this political construction, right? So when I talk about the lower classes, I mean these popular classes, they are really big and heterogeneous groups, right? So it's people from the cities, the urban plebeians, artisans, slaves, peasants, rural wage laborers, right? All of them have really big differences among them, but you can put them all in a big group, right? This includes poor whites, and also, in the colonial Latin American and Spanish American area, there was this called the castes, right? That was that everybody that was not considered white had different rights. I mean, if you had mestizo blood, being from African heritage or indigenous heritage, you, like in Spain before with Jews and Arabs, you were considered someone inferior, right, with different rights. So all the people of the castes and also slaves, that it was a specific condition, all of them, not all of them, but many people from these groups enter politics in the moment of the Republican building, right? And also the indigenous communities that were not part of the castes, and they had their own agencies with their own ethnic authorities and their own objectives, right? So to put all these groups together is something that is risky, but you can do it because all of them share this idea of being not part of the elites, right? So being inferior to them, but all of them happen to participate in this new political life that gave birth to new countries, right? So when I started to read about this, and as I told you, it's a big, big thing. I mean, now a lot of historiography, I had to change my periodization, right? I was trying to start by the moment of the revolution against Spain that started in the whole Spanish American Empire around 1810, 1808, 1809. After the French invaded Spain in 1808, they took the Spanish king as a prisoner. The new king that Napoleon Bonaparte, the French emperor, put there was not recognized by their subjects, and so these revolutions started, right? In the beginning, fighting for self-government inside the Spanish monarchy, and then eventually turning into an independent outcome that was not planned in advance, but it was part of the fight, right? Something similar what happens in the US, right? Not everybody was thinking of independence when they started, and that was the eventual consequence of the war and the fighting between loyalists and revolutionary. So the thing was that I always thought as a researcher that this was the moment of this start of popular participation in politics, but now reading more things, I changed my view, and I think that we have to go back until the beginning of what today historians call the Age of Revolutions, right? I mean, this moment after the 7 Years' War, when this idea of the sovereignty of the people appear, and this entrance of common people, especially men, but also women in the real practice, started to participate in politics, right? And to reclaim that especially every man has the right to be part of the discussions of what its community is going to be, right? So this is one of the big, who's going to rule and why is one of the big questions of this key moment of the Age of Revolutions, right? That starts here in the US, in France, and in Haiti, right? Traditionally, you may know, historians like Eric Hobsbawm, like 60 years ago, said, okay, to understand how this modern world was born, you have to focus on the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution in England, right? Then historians, as Robert Palmer here said, okay, but they are democratic revolutions, and you have to put the French Revolution and the American, the US Revolution, right? Then, some years later, some scholars said, okay, but Haiti, right, with this slave revolution is also as important as the French and the American to understand this change in the world. And some Latin Americanists, especially Spanish Americanist historians says, okay, but there's also a Spanish American leg, a Spanish American branch of this age of revolution that in part was related with the influence of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the slave revolution in Haiti, but also has a local branch, right? That has to do that, take a look. In this giant empire, right, there were two big revolts in the 1780s, right? Very famous. The commoners' revolt in what today is Colombia, in that period, Nueva Granada, in 1780, and in the same year, the giant indigenous revolt of Tupac Amaru, Tupac Katari, and some other leaders, right? The Andean Revolution, that also had democratic objectives without the ideas of the Enlightenment or without the theory like some American or French Revolution had, but with the same idea of changing who was going to have the power, right? During the 18th century, there were indigenous groups in the Andes that were reclaiming equality between Indians and whites, right? So if the Spanish Empire had been founded on the idea of two different republics, right? The Republic of Spaniards, the Republic of Indians, and one was above the other one. So if you were asking for equality of both republics, this was the end of the empire, because the empire was unequal by definition, right? So eventually, several historians have traced these small fights, the small struggles in different communities that eventually led to this giant revolt. That the problem was that, like the commoners in Nueva Granada, both revolutions were defeated. So as they were not victorious, they were not as influential as the ones that won, like the French, American, or Haitian revolutions, right? But I always said, you don't have to judge revolutions because of its result, right? Because the revolution happened, and then sometimes they are victorious, sometimes they lose, but that doesn't make them less revolutionary than the others, right? So the interesting thing there is that there were also democratic revolutions that fighting for, as the indigenous groups in the Andes said, we want a war ruled by the Indians, right? And not that we alone will rule at last after all these imperial years, right? So the local branch is really important in the Spanish-American revolutions that came later. And also something that is very important in the Spanish tradition, that is the idea of the común in Spanish, right? The common, that the commoners have rights, right? In Nueva Granada, in what today is Colombia, in North South America, they said the common, el común, has more rights than the king to decide, for example, taxes, right? So why does the king, because in that moment there was a moment of change of, as it happened in all the empires after the 7 Year War, right? These empires rising taxes to support big armies to fight their wars, right? It happened here by the British, it happened in the French, that then went to this break of the empire that started the French Revolution in 1789, and it happened in the Spanish Empire that wanted more established armies, more taxes to pay for these wars, right? So in different parts of the continent say, why do we have to pay more, right? So they didn't say no taxation without representation, but they say the king can't raise taxes without consulting the common, because the common has as rights as the king, right? So, and that's how they went to war against the functionaries of the monarchy, with this strange, for us, scream that is, long live the king, dead to the bad government, right? So fighting for the king, but against his functionaries. So today it's quite funny, but it was very common in that period, right, of the monarchical era. So these guys were saying that they were doing a traditional thing, as for example in the U.S. the revolutionary did in the beginning, saying they were Whigs, right, and they were fighting the country against the court. Same thing in South America. They said, we are doing a traditional thing. We want to go to a golden era that we have lost, right, where the commons had power. But in fact, they were changing things. It was new. I mean, with the traditional language, they were doing something different. They was revolting against the king, right? You understand me, right? Following, in the name of the king, they were not following his policies, right? So they were defeated, as I said, but it is interesting to think, because something that hasn't been researched yet, of this commoners tradition that is very long in the Spanish Empire. In the 16th century, there was a comuneros revolt in Spain against the first Habsburg king, Charles V, right? And if you read, for example, the Spanish theater, it's all the time there. There's a very famous play of the 17th century by Lope de Vega called Fuente Ovejuna, right? So the play goes when the villagers of Fuente Ovejuna, a small town, killed this guy, in Spanish would be the comendador, the commendator, right? The leader of the town. It's killed by the town. So when the king makes the justice then, he asks the people in the play, who killed the commendador, right? It was Fuente Ovejuna, they say. But who in Fuente Ovejuna? No, it was the town. Everybody killed him, right? Like the common. So, I mean, these kind of plays were read all the time in South America and in North Spanish America, right? It was part of the tradition they had, of the political culture they had. And it is interesting to trace this, because later in the 19th century, this doesn't appear anymore in the political speech, right? This idea of the common. And it's replaced by a different concept that came the key concept in the period of the revolutions, which is people, right? In Spanish, pueblo, right? So the revolutions that came later, this is the 18th century, right? That later, 30 years later, that started in 1810 and eventually led to this independence of new countries, were not done in the name of the common, but in the name of the people, right? We, the people, has the right to rule. And as some historians has pointed out, I mean, this concept of people started to be a key in Europe, in America, in India, and in different places. This idea of that very different popular groups could consider themselves the people, right? So this was one of the big debates when this new revolutionary period started in South America, right? In the 1810s. Who was going to be the people? If these revolutions were done in the name of the people, who is part of the people, right? Because traditionally, in the Spanish tradition, in Spanish, the word pueblo has many meanings, right? It's a small town, and it's people at the same time. So sometimes it's difficult for our historians to understand what they are saying when they say the sovereignty is the people. Is the towns, right? That the cities that constitute the monarchy, or is the people that integrate these towns? And both notions were used at the same time in that complicated period of independence, right? So it's hard to read the sources. But the interesting thing is that the entrance of popular groups in politics made that many men, not women, but ask for political rights as the people. So you can trace in the different research in the whole continent how there were episodes in the decade of 1810 where you have people of the castes, poor whites, these peasants, urban plebeians saying, we the people want this, or we are the people, right? Or participating in different movements led by people from the upper classes, but where these guys said, we have political rights. And so something interesting is 10 years after the revolution started in the 1810, in the 1820s, if you read the constitutions that appear in most of the republics that were created because of this independence war, most of them gave a lot of political rights to men, not to women, right? For example, in Buenos Aires, the province that I have studied myself, in 1821, there was an electoral law that said every man that is 21 years old can vote, no matter property, nothing, right? Just slaves and women don't have votes, right? Women in that moment didn't have votes anywhere, right? The political rights were not included, even if they were participating in politics by other means, right? But not legally. So slaves couldn't vote, but all the others could vote. So it was, for the moment, quite broad, right? It was, so many people have the right to go to the elections, and they did, right? This is the map, in fact, of this previous yellow empire, right? How it was divided, and the appearance of many republics. The only not republic was Brazil, right? That from the Portuguese Empire that became a monarchy, right? A constitutional monarchy. But all the other parts of the Spanish Empire became, except Mexico for 3 years, became republics, right? So in this process of construction of republics, of revolution, and from the 1810s to the 1830s, where you have this moment of collapse and the build of something new, you have this massive entrance of peasants, indigenous groups, slaves in politics, following their own agencies and making some pressure on the leaders, right? And the interesting thing is that historically, as you know, you have to focus always in the different regions and different cities, and you have many differences among the areas, right? So in some places, this popular participation was really radical, in others was more moderate, right? But in some places, it was interesting that some racial and social hierarchies were challenged in the moment of revolution and war, right? I will give you a couple of examples. In Cartagena, in North Colombia, in the Caribbean, right? Like here. There was a port city with a very big Pardo community. Pardo are the mestizos of white and black, right? Called Pardos in Spanish. So the majority of the population was Pardo, and they entered in the 1810s in politics, asking for the Pardos to have the same rights as the whites to vote and to be part of the politics, right? And so if you read the first laws that were done in Cartagena in 1811, 1812, they include equality for the Pardos, which was not because the white elites were good people that wanted to give them that, but there was a strong pressure in the streets and in the militia by these Pardo groups, right? So I don't say that in all Latin America the Pardos did the same thing. So that's why we have to study case by case. But in Cartagena, this radicalization of the Pardo population was really strong. In the area where I come from, right? In what today is Uruguay and part of what today is Argentina, there was a strong movement led by a guy called Artigas, right? Today he's like the founding father of Uruguay, right? But he was a very influential character, right? So the followers of Artigas had a motto that said, nobody is more than nobody, right? And they said that they wanted the resources to be open, right? And that they could raise their cattle, use their lands without being controlled by the big landowners. And they wanted the natural resources to be free for everybody, right? So, and that had to be with some local tensions that were there before the revolutionary period, but this is what the revolution made, as in many revolutions, that previous tensions became politicized, right? Like the tension, racial tension with the Pardos in Cartagena was there before. With the revolution, it became political. The discussion about the land and the use of resources was very hard in this area of Uruguay and part of Argentina, and it became political when the revolutionary came. It was not this that led to revolution, but when this revolution appeared, all these previous tensions became, you say politicized, right? I mean, expressed and discussed in political life, okay? But the interesting thing that the new research are showing is that not only in the revolutionary side, like in Cartagena or in the Artigas movement, there was a political popular participation. Also in the loyalist side, people who fought for the king against the revolutionary leaders, there was a very strong popular participation, right? For example, in South Colombia, or in Venezuela, right? In that areas you had pardos, slaves, indigenous communities fighting against the aristocratic revolutionary leaders, right, that fought for self-government, and they fought for the king against them. So in their fight for the king and in theory for conservative positions, they were also challenging the local hierarchies, right? The power of these white elites that were fighting for self-government and to be separated from the Spanish kingdom. So it's not that easy. I mean, you have to focus in each case why, because of local positions, the different groups did different things in this, very controversial and agitated years of revolution. So if you see case by case, it's very long and very boring, right? You have to talk hours about what happened in each part. But the interesting thing is that when you take the whole region, you have that after this long war that lasted 15 years and the creation of different countries that you can see there that were not planned in advance, but the result of this fight and this, that nobody could have said before 1810 that South America was going to be like in this map, and this map was changed later, right? I mean, and it's not nowadays map. But the interesting thing is that the elites, after this big earthquake of politics that appeared in the 1810s, had to build new republics that they were leading, but they have to deal with this political participation. So how did they do that, right? I mean, how could they create a new order that had to include these groups that not only in theory, because they decided to build republics and every republic is done in the name of the people, right? I mean, the sovereignty is in the people, but also because these people were already there, I mean, doing politics, right? So if you study the history of Latin America between the 1830s to the 1860s, 70s, you will see in every country this problem of how to order the political life, right? Until in the late 19th century, in every country, the local elites managed to control politics, right? And to make this, what we call this conservative periods in every country where there are groups that control politics very well, right? Even if they had political defiances, they could manage them. And it was also the moment in which the whole Latin America entered the war market as a big producer of raw materials. And in that moment of economic growth, the local elites had more power to deal with local situations, right? There are always exceptions, but you can trace this map in the whole area. But in between the revolution, the independence, and this moment of in the 1880s, 1890s, of this entrance of Latin America in the world market in a successful way that lasted until, I don't know, the 1930s, there was this, it was a very, very interesting for historians era, very traumatic era for the local groups where they have to deal with this, right? I mean, how to canalize, how to conduct the popular participation in politics. And if you think of South America, there was a very strong figure that sometimes is a sort of stereotype to think of it. That is the idea of the caudillo, right? Caudillo. these strong men, propertors, rural landowners who led men to fight against others, and they construct sometimes very strong powers, such as, you know, Rosas in Argentina or Paez in Venezuela, right? But now the new research on this topic has shown that these leaders, these popular leaders, very charismatic and very powerful and rich guys, had to deal with all the demands of their followers. If you see how Rosas, for example, constructed his power, he all the time was negotiating with the African community in Buenos Aires, with the artisans of the city, giving them some protection that they demanded, with the rural laborers that wanted land and giving them land in the frontier. So it was not only that they were strong men, good soldiers, and charismatic, but that they had to contemplate all these demands that the revolution had allowed the popular groups to present, right? And they have to contemplate that to be leaders in politics, right? So if you focus in different parts of South America, during the 19th century, any successful leader had to be, in a way, a popular leader, right? Which is something that was not true anymore in the last part of the century, where, you know, these new politicians didn't have really to be, I mean, popular leaders that negotiate, that talk in the popular way, and that had to be like, you know, bargaining with their followers. This didn't last anymore. It was just a moment in the 19th century, right? It is interesting that, of course, if you don't want to build a romantic view about this, sometimes this popular participation had strong results. Some others, nothing happened, right? Just all these defiances of the revolutionary period sometimes were lost or defeated. But in some aspects, there was a strong influence. For example, in the end of slavery, right? If you think in all the Hispanic American empire, after the revolutions and the independence, there was not this called second slavery, like in Brazil, in the south of the US, or in Cuba, that remained part of the Spanish Empire, right? Slavery remained very weak after the revolution of independence in South America and in Mexico too. In Mexico, it was not that important, and that was part of this entrance of the slaves in the politics, right? So it's very interesting when you study that. For example, I will take just one case, which is what today is Argentina, the one I know better. You know, in 1810, the revolution starts, right? So these leaders of the revolution knows there's a contradiction, right? They fight for freedom and they have slaves, which is something that you know too, right? So they said, what do we do? I mean, because this is a contradiction, because they knew that, but the slaves knew that too. And you have a lot of documents of slaves saying, well, now is the time of freedom because we are fighting for freedom, right? So they say, well, the slaves are not prepared for freedom yet because they don't have culture, they don't have education. So we have to finish with slavery gradually, right? So in 1812, the revolutionary government said, no more slaves can be sold here, right? So the traffic is done. Any ship that comes to the coast of the now called Provincias Unidas of the Rio de la Plata, what today is Argentina, they will be free when they land here, okay? And 1 year later, in 1813, they passed an WAM Act, right? So a WAM Act. Any woman that had new children, if she was a slave, her children will going to be free since their birth, right? So if you don't buy new slaves and no new slaves are born, when these current slaves are dead, slavery is done, right? That was the idea. That was okay, except for the slaves that wanted freedom in that moment. Imagine this is a revolutionary moment, so a lot of political agitation going on. So there was a lot of pressure by the slaves that didn't get abolition, but for men, not for women, there was an opportunity in the army. Because as the war against Spaniards started to be long, the state needed more soldiers. And this is difficult to get. So the draft was something very unpopular, like every time in a war. So they started to offer the slaves to go to war. And if a slave entered the army, he became not free, not slave, some like limbo, right? Juridical limbo, called in Spanish, liberto, right? Liberto. A liberto is someone who is not anymore a slave, but he's not free until he finishes his military service, right? But I have researched this. There are many acts of slaves putting pressure on their masters to be part of the army. And so many soldiers enter. For example, the army that won the war in that part of South America was led by José San Martín, who today is the most important national hero in Argentina, San Martín, right? His army that crossed the Andes Mountains and attacked the loyalists in Chile, right, had 5,000 soldiers. Of these 5,000 soldiers, all the infantry, like, almost 2,000, were slaves, former slaves, right? Born in Congo, Mozambique, Angola, right? That were not slaves anymore, they were libertos, and that gained their freedom in this service, right? So when the ones who came back were free. So after the independence, you have this paradox of much more women slaves than men because of the military service, right? So slavery was still profitable economically speaking, but because of the revolution and because of this slave participation, they had to try to replace slavery by other ways of manpower, right? Which was not easy for the landowners in what today is Argentina, and there were many tries of how to replace this slave manpower, right? So it was not that economically it was not useful anymore. It was that they couldn't, because of the revolution, go back to the previous economical system. And the same happened in different parts of the continent, right? So abolition didn't come, but the slavery as an institution became very weakened by the Revolutionary War, right? And by mid-19th century, all of these countries had no slaves anymore. I mean, slavery was abolished in all the area, right? That is not to say that this idea of building equal republics was true, right? I mean, all these new republics in South America had the idea of we are now a liberal republic, we are all equal, which is not true at all. You know, this racism remained very important, but not juridically, right? I mean, this idea of a society built on castes and different republics, right, with different rights, was done during the revolutionary years, and it was not only because of the decision of some very important leaders, but also because of this political entrance in politics that put the pressure on them to make those changes, right? So this was something of the 19th century that, as I told you, finished, you know, in the moment of this golden moment of South America after the last part of the 19th century. But some of these practices that appear in the 19th century live through the 20th century too. And in these so-called populist movements of the 20th century, you can see a lot of practices that in fact appear in the 19th century that were not invented, let's say in Peronism or in Mexico in the 1930s, or in Peru with the APRA. You know, this was not all invented in the 20th century, even if they have a lot of modern things, but they also recover traditions of popular participation, of popular agendas that were there before, and that sometimes are not so clear when we study 20th and 19th century, right? I will give you just one example of Argentina, you know. The followers of Perón in the 1940s were called the descamisados, right? The fellows without shirts. And I always ask my father, why do they call them descamisados if you see the pictures and they have shirts? And my father said, well, because they don't have suits, but it will be not descamisados, desacados, right, or something like that. So, this is because, in fact, they were taking a very old word used in the 19th century to call people who really didn't have shirts. Because, in these societies before the industry, the clothes, dressing was really the social way of dividing society. I always say the same, sorry, the ones that have been in class already. Today, a poor guy and a rich guy use jeans, right? The jeans can be different, and the brand is different, the price is different, but it's the same trouser, right? But in that society, people never dress the same way. So wealthy people use frocks, right? Use suits. Poor people use, in Argentina, ponchos, in Colombia, ruanas, right? Depending, but sometimes they didn't have nothing under this wool, right? Just no shirt, right? So this idea of, in the age of revolution, of measuring the society by the clothes was really important, right? Like the sans-culotte in the French Revolution, the ones who doesn't have their culotte, which is the trousers that the elites wear, but the ones that didn't have their culotte were sans-culotte. This is the way to call them, right? And if you read trials, that we, the people who work with popular history, use a lot of trials because we deal a lot of time with people that couldn't write, so they don't have testimonies. So how do we read what they thought? Sometimes if you go to a trial, there was a crime in a grocery, and so someone said, okay, I saw it, and you have his testimony or her testimony, right? So it's not the best way of knowing what people thought, but it's the only one sometimes. And in those kind of sources, you have all the time people talking about other people by their clothes, right? They were people of poncho, they were people of frocks, so you can see their social belonging, right? So this idea, just that symbol, the descamisado from the 19th century, was the way that the Peronist groups choose in the 20th century to call themselves. So you have many changes in South America between the 19th and the 20th century, but what I try to point is that this popular presence in politics has to be traced back if you want to understand what happened later in that continent. I think that's all, sorry.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Dr. Di Meglio. You now have a chance for some questions. We have a few minutes. So in the tradition of the Kennedy Center, if you want to make your way over to the microphone, because this is being recorded for posterity, you can make your way up here, your name, your major, and ask Dr. Di Meglio a question.
Fascinating. Thank you very much for your presentation. My question, I have quite a few questions, but I'm only going to give one, or ask one. The idea of political participation, I guess in my mind, has a lot to do with suffrage, the ability to make your voice heard through the vote. And I think that's sort of at least a modern conceptualization of political participation, as well as special interest groups, I suppose. But as far as the popular class, or the pueblo, the people, what sort of participation without having suffrage
Okay.
are we talking about? You talk about Rosas, sounds like it's economic participation by the artisans, for example. What other than suffrage, what kind of participation are we talking about?
Well, thank you. That's a very good and complicated question, but of course, suffrage is a key, right? And all these, after the revolution, if you compare the 1810s with what happens from the 1820s on, in all these new countries, they try to build electoral systems, right? With quite open possibilities of voting, right? For men, not for women. But politics was not just that. Sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't work so well. And there were other ways of making politics. For example, something that had to do with the earlier years when, in the moment of the revolution, there were not clear rules of how was going to be I mean, who was going to rule and why, right? Sometimes you have street demonstrations. You had the participation of militias, you know, that in theory they were going to defend the territory, but they were also saying, okay, no, we will go to the square and we will say that this guy has to be part of the government, right, or has to rule. And then you have this participation in guerrillas or in you know, montoneras in Spanish, right? I mean, these groups that sometimes pressure by arms or by not using the arms, but menacing with that. I mean, threatening. All of this is also politics in that period, right? I mean, all of these other ways of entering, and even women went to the elections without voting, but putting, you know, billboards. I mean, putting, making demonstrations, shouting for a candidate. So the political life was bigger than only the act of voting, right? And especially, you know, in the moment of the revolution, it was not clear who was going to, I mean, which were going to be the rules, right? For example, one case of Buenos Aires, in 1811, you know, there was this, the first revolutionary government, that was a collective government, the junta. They didn't, I mean, there were two groups, the conservative group, and the moderate group, and the radical group. And the moderate wanted to put the radical deputies out of this junta. So, but how could they do that without rules, right? So what did they do? They organized a street demonstration. So they brought followers that had their own demands, right? They took these demands and they said, okay, and to do all these demands, that was, for example, ejecting the Spaniards from the city of Buenos Aires, we will put these deputies, radical deputies, out. So as suffrage and voting was not yet organized, so they used other ways. So this demonstration, this mobilizing people became part of politics, not organized, not formal, but as sometimes more important than the suffrage for political life. So it's a very agitated political life, I would say. It depends on which city, which region, but all these ways of popular mobilization were there. So, yeah.
So I really liked your bit where you talked about how slaves made up a large portion of San Martin's army.
Mm-hmm.
So you had Bill Grana's army in the north, which is mostly gauchos, Artigas and his Uruguayos, and then Rondo and whoever composed them, and were trying to retake Uruguay. But how come the majority of the slaves were in San Martin's army? Was it because he was the most vocalist activist for abolition, or is it because the rest of the United Republics was kind of not willing to talk about it and just allowed him to take the ball, and that's why they didn't make up anyone else's army?
No, thank you. No, I mean, San Martin, in fact, was more moderate as a leader than others, like Artigas or others. But he was a professional military, and he did know that he had to organize his army very well. So he took a lot of time asking the government in Buenos Aires to send him troops. And it was, in a given moment, they decided that they needed to do this. I mean, that if they wanted to win the war and they wanted a big army, they had to, it was organized between San Martin and the government, said we have to send a big amount of slaves, right? And so San Martin himself used a kind of trick in Mendoza, you know, near the Andes Mountains, where he was organizing the army. He said that he had rumors that in Buenos Aires they were thinking of abolition. So why don't you sell me? Because if you wanted to put your slaves, if you had slaves in the army, you got some money of compensation, right? So he said, but not the same amount of money that this slave had costed before in the market. So he said, I know that abolition is going to come, so why don't you sell me your slaves, and you will, because if abolition comes, you won't get anything. So, and that worked. So he got a lot of slaves from San Juan, Mendoza, San Luis, the area where he was in the provinces, through this trick, right? But also many slaves were sent from Buenos Aires. The word in Spanish was rescatar slaves, right? So to pay some money to their owners, get the slaves, and send them to the army. And so many slaves from Buenos Aires were sent, organized in battalions already, to his army. So it was a big amount in the whole army. So, and San Martin said in a famous writing that the slaves were the best infantry he had, that the local people were very good to be, how you say it in English? Riders, right? Ride horses, but slaves were great for former slaves, for fighting as soldiers, right? Infantry. And his whole infantry was made by. And these former slaves went with him until the liberation of Peru, to Lima. Right? Okay.
All right, well, let's
Got that?
give Dr. Di Meglio another hand.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.